Hello again, anatomy students. We're ready now to move on to our next topic in cardiovascular system. We've discussed the location and the size of the heart. We talked about some of its important tissues. We discussed the different chambers and the valves. We talked about how blood is pumped from the body into the heart, back into the lungs, into the heart, back to the rest of the body. And so now we're ready to move on and talk about various heart actions. So we're going to be looking at the cardiac cycle. We're looking about why your heart beat sounds the way that it does. We'll be talking about the conduction system, and we'll also then be talking about the regulation of the cardiac cycle. And so here we go with heart actions. Remember, in our last talk, we talked about the fact that we have both contraction and relaxation. And so what happens, we have the two different types of heart chambers. We have the upper chambers, which is our atria, the bottom chambers, which are our ventricles. When the atria are contracted, the ventricles are relaxed, or when the ventricles are contracted, the atria are relaxed. And so they're either one or the other, so they're timed that way. And so we can, for example, look at what is called systole and diastole. And so when we have, for example, atrial systole, this is when the upper chambers, again called the atria, contract, while the ventricular diastole is when the ventricles relax. And so we can see then this is when there's being blood pumped from the atria back into the ventricles. And so notice that if we were to look at the time scale here, it happens within a tenth of a second. So this is fairly quickly. All right. Ventricular systole then is when the ventricles contract, while the atrial diastole is where the atria relax. And so again, notice that when one set of chambers is contracting, the other set of chambers are relaxing. And so it goes back and forth between contracting and relaxing. Then the atria and ventricles both relax for a brief interval. And so just like us, after we've been working out for a while, it's always good to just take a few moments just to sit back and breathe and then go right back into it again. Your heart also needs to do this, and so once we go through this cycle, it's going to go ahead and stop. And so together, the diastole and the systole make up what's known as the cardiac cycle, and that results in the characteristic heartbeat. And so I want to also point out that the time it takes for the whole cardiac cycle is 8/10 of a second. And so a fraction of a second, and your body has already gone through a complete cardiac cycle. I want to talk a little bit about those sounds you hear when you you feel your heart and you can feel it. What exactly causes that to happen? I want to go ahead and show you guys a video that will describe what that is. And so we're going to go ahead and talk just briefly. The first heart sound you hear, the lub part, occurs when the atrioventricular valves close. And so the atrioventricular valves are the two valves that separate out the atria from the ventricles. That, of course, would be the tricuspid valve and the mitral or bicuspid valve. So together, these two are known as the atrioventricular valves. The second heart sound, the dup, occurs when the semilunar valves close. And so the semilunar valves, the reason they're called semilunar valves is because they look like half moons. And so this would consist of your pulmonary valve and your aortic valve. And so then that would be the second sound. So because this cardiac cycle occurs within 8/10 of a second, it happens so fast that when your valves close shut, that is the sound that you hear from your heartbeat. So the lub, the first sound, is when these two valves close, your tricuspid and your bicuspid. The dub is the second heartbeat sound, and so that's going to be when your pulmonary and your aortic valves then slam shut. And so let me go ahead and show you guys a quick video that will then talk about this as well. All right. So hopefully you're not too nervous, because whenever I hear a heartbeat like that, it always kind of gets me excited. So, but again, the reason that the heart sounds the way that it does is the slamming shut of the two sets of valves within your heart. And so it happens so fast that it does make an audible sound. So the lupped up, lupped up, lupped up is the closing, the shutting of those valves. All right. Right. When I look a little closer at the cardiac conduction system overall, we're going to look next at an ECG, an electrocardiogram. And so this is going to characterize the different parts of the systole versus the diastole and what is actually happening here. And so remember that even though we're on the cardiovascular system, all the body systems tie in together. And so again, we're going to see how the nervous system ties in, because remember, the nervous system is based upon electricity. Shocking, right? All right. When we first start off here, we have an electrical impulse that will travel from the sinoatrial node, also called the SA node, to the walls of the atria, which causes them to contract. And so this is this first little wave right here. Then we have an impulse that reaches the AV, or atrioventricular node, and delays it by about 1/10 of a second. Then when we have the bundle branches, and so these are the Purkinje fibers, this is going to carry signals from the AV node to the heart apex, so the point at the distal end of the heart. And so the signal then will spread through the ventricular walls and then causing them to contract. So notice at this point you have a significant spike in electrical activity. And so it's basically trying to show you how the AV node and the SA node help keep your heart beating in a normal, continuous rate, hopefully. All right. The cardiac system will coordinate the events of the cardiac cycle. The sinoatrial, we're going to just abbreviate it as SA, node is a key part of the system and can reach the threshold on their own, and their cell membranes contract one another. And so just again to remind you, remember that the resting cell potential is negative 55 millivolts, and so as long as it hits that, then it will hit the threshold and will go through the normal contraction. All right, the SA node will generate the heart's rhythmic contractions, and so it's also known as a pacemaker. And so this is different from the artificial pacemakers they put in the people that have problems with their heart. Your body has its own pacemaker in the form of this SA node. And so if there's a problem with your SA node, then you have a serious problem then with your heart rate, and you might end up dying from it. And so it's important that this is tightly regulated. The impulse, as we saw in the previous slide, will reach the AV node, where it passes into a group of large fibers that make up what's called the AV bundle. And so the AV bundle will divide into right and left branches that then give rise to what are known as Purkinje fibers. And so those are the fibers that are found in the myocardium tissue. And remember, the myocardium is full of that tough, dense muscle that allows for the contraction of the ventricles, which allows you to push the blood then through the rest of your body. And so the Purkinje fibers will stimulate the muscle fibers, causing the ventricular walls to contract, which then squeezes blood into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And so even though we're dealing with the cardiac conduction system, we can also see that the nervous system also plays a role in keeping your heart going. And so remember, all the body systems are connected together, and they all have to work in unison in order to keep you alive, in order to help you maintain homeostasis. All right. I want to break down the parts of an ECG, and so this will be one of the figures that will be on your test. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you what each of these means. And so we first start off over here on the left. The vertical is looking at the voltage, and the horizontal is looking at the time. And so again, we're looking to see how these electrical impulses from the SA and the AV nodes are then able to trigger your heart into contracting in a proper rhythmic sort of way. This first bump here is known as a P wave. I'm not sure where these cardiologists got these letters from. I guess they just decided it was kind of neat to use. And so this first part here is the P wave. The P wave is when you have the depolarization of the atria in response to the sinoatrial node triggering. And so remember, this again is the pacemaker part of your heart. And so this has to happen first. So there is a slight increase in voltage. Then we have what's referred to as the PR interval. This is a delay of the AV node, atrioventricular node, which allows the filling of the ventricles. And so they're going to be filled up with potential charge. All right. This next curve here does this, and so it's made up of what's known as the QRS complex. And so notice that the voltage change here is the greatest out of the whole rest of the curve. And so this is when there's a depolarization of the ventricles, which triggers the main pumping contraction. So remember, the ventricles, the lower chambers of your heart, has to push the blood through the rest of your body. And so this is where you have a giant impulse in electrical activity. We also have an ST segment, which then begins ventricle repolarization, which then should be flat, hopefully. And then we also then have another wave, the T wave, which is the ventricular repolarization. And so based upon this, we now have a complete cardiac cycle. So the membranes have reached the threshold potential. They have contracted the ventricles then repolarize, and then it is set up then for the next cycle. And so this repeats itself until for as long as the organism is alive. All right. I want to finish today looking at the regulation of the cardiac cycle. So just like our pH, just like our temperature in our body, again, we're trying to maintain homeostasis, and so we do need to talk just a little bit about how the cardiac cycle is regulated. All right. We have extrinsic control of the heart rate and rhythm. It's achieved via autonomic nervous system impulses, because remember, do you have to think about keeping your heart beating and pumping blood through your body? Of course not, because that's all taken care of by the autonomic nervous system. That's all done for you without you having to think about it, which is good, because that would probably drive me nuts if I had to think about pumping my heart every 0.8 of a second. I don't think anybody could do that. All right. It's regulated by the medulla oblongata and specific hormones that alter the contractile and or conductive properties of heart muscle. So this also then ties into the endocrine system. So it does also talk a little bit about that as well. So again, we can see how we have the cardiac system, we have the nervous system, we have the endocrine system. They're all coming together to help keep your heart beating in the right rhythm. The regulation impulse conduction results from the fact that parasympathetic fibers utilize acetylcholine. There's our major neurotransmitter. Remember, we gave it the abbreviation capital A, capital C, little h. And so we can see that this is also in play here. It's going to alter the transmission of the action potential by altering the membrane permeability to potassium ions. And so remember also that potassium ions can be a little leaky, and so that is also why remember that the membrane potential is negative on the inside. And so just a sort of a remembrance of what we talked about back during the nervous system. All right. In contrast, sympathetic postganglionic neurons will secrete the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, NE, that will then alter the membrane permeability to either sodium or calcium ions. So again, we can see the involvement of the endocrine system here with relation to the sympathetic division of the nervous system. We can also see the fact that we have the sodium ions and the potassium and calcium ions and the hormone norepinephrine, which, as you remember, is again secreted by the adrenal glands, which again sit on top of your kidneys. And so with that, we're going to stop here for the day. And so we'll continue then tomorrow by talking about blood vessels. And I hope you all have a great rest of your